In the spring of 1857, when most families in the rural corners of Pennsylvania relied on tight-knit communities and the rhythm of the seasons, Samuel Harker lived apart from both. He was a farmer by trade, but one who never seemed to belong to the world around him. His land stretched far beyond the main road, the farmhouse sitting like a lonely sentinel at the edge of a dark wood, and his reputation among neighbors was one of suspicion rather than familiarity. The people in the nearby town remembered him as a tall, lean man with a face that looked as though it had been carved in stone, rarely smiling and never seeking company. Unlike other farmers who often came into the market square to barter, share news, or simply to gossip, Samuel made his visits brief and silent. He sold what he needed to sell, bought salt, grain, or tools, and disappeared back to his farm without a word more than was required. There were whispers, of course. They said Samuel had come from a family of rough stock, men who drank hard and worked harder, but who were also known for their cruelty. Some claimed that when he was a boy they had seen him watching the slaughter of animals with an unusual intensity, a strange fascination in his eyes, as if death itself was something to be studied rather than mourned. By the time he was a man of 30, Samuel had already cultivated a reputation for being both a skilled farmer and a merciless one. His animals were kept in perfect condition, fattened and healthy, but he treated his family as if they were little more than extensions of his land workers who were meant to obey, tools to be used until they broke. His wife, Ruth, was rarely seen in town. When she did appear, she kept her head low, eyes cast downward, as though the very act of meeting another person's gaze might cause trouble. Their children, 3 in total, followed the same pattern. They wore plain clothes, their hands calloused like grown men's and women's despite their youth. None of them played with the other children of the community. When asked, Samuel explained it away with a curt statement: "Work leaves no time for foolishness." That became one of the most quoted phrases about him, repeated long after the events that would shock the town. But it was not merely his severity that set him apart. It was his unusual devotion to his pigs. Farmers in those days kept pigs for practical purposes: meat, lard, and trade. Yet Samuel seemed to treat his hogs with an almost obsessive attention. Neighbors remarked on how often he could be found in the pens, standing motionless among the animals, watching them as though they were companions. He spoke to them, they said, his low voice carrying across the fields when the wind was right. Some dismissed it as the harmless eccentricity of a man who lived too long in isolation. Others felt there was something darker in it, something unsettling in the way he preferred the company of animals to people. When winter passed into spring, the Harker farm should have been a place of renewal like any other. Seeds were to be planted, animals fattened, and new life expected in every corner of the land. Instead, the farm carried a heaviness that was hard to ignore. Travelers who passed by on the long dirt road noted the silence that hung over the place, as though laughter and conversation had been banished. They saw Samuel working from dawn until nightfall, his figure bent but tireless, and they saw the pigs, always well-fed, always restless, and strangely fat for the season. It was this detail, insignificant at first, that would later come to hold a chilling weight in the minds of those who pieced together what had happened there. By then, neighbors already had reason to keep their distance. They said that late at night, the lanterns on the Harker farm still burned, and strange noises could be heard, not the ordinary sounds of farm work, but sharp cries that carried on the wind, cut off abruptly as if swallowed by the earth. Few dared to investigate. After all, Samuel Harker was a man whose silence was as sharp as his temper. Those who tried to ask questions found themselves fixed with his cold stare, a look that said more clearly than words that he had no interest in being part of their world. And so the farm remained a place of unease, with only Samuel's shadow moving steadily across the fields and the pigs growing fatter with each passing week. In hindsight, the signs were there, scattered like warnings across the landscape of his life, the isolation, the harshness, the unnatural closeness to his animals. But in that moment, in the year of 1857, the people of the town did not yet understand what those signs meant. They only knew that Samuel Harker was a man apart, and that something about his farm made the hairs rise on the back of their necks when they passed by. It was the beginning of a story that would soon stain the soil of his land with fear and mark his name in the chronicles of American crime forever. Life inside the Harker farmhouse was as bleak as the land that surrounded it, though few outsiders ever caught a clear glimpse of what happened beyond its weather-beaten walls. Samuel ruled the household with the same severity he used on his farm. For him, there was no distinction between tending fields, managing livestock, and raising a family. Each was a form of labor, and each was subject to his rigid control. His wife, Ruth, bore the brunt of his cruelty most openly. Married young and without family nearby to lean on, she had little choice but to endure the circumstances fate had handed her. Her days were filled with relentless work, from milking cows before dawn to cooking meals for a household that was never satisfied, to mending clothes and scrubbing floors until her hands cracked and bled. Yet it wasn't the labor alone that ground her spirit down. It was the constant presence of Samuel's disapproving eyes, the looming threat of his temper should she falter even for a moment. Neighbors remembered seeing her only a handful of times each year, usually when she accompanied Samuel into town to purchase supplies. On those occasions, she spoke little, if at all. There was an exhaustion etched into her face that no amount of sleep could cure. Her clothes, while clean, were worn and patched in too many places to ignore. Some remarked that she looked as though she were shrinking into herself, growing thinner, weaker, as though she were quietly being erased by the life she was forced to lead. And yet she bore Samuel's children, 3 in total, each of whom became an extension of his will. The children's lives were no gentler. From the moment they could walk, they were expected to work. The eldest boy, Thomas, no older than 12 in 1857, carried responsibilities fit for a grown man. He was tasked with chopping wood, hauling water, and tending the animals alongside his father. His hands were blistered and rough, his back already beginning to curve under the weight of his burdens. The younger 2, Sarah and James, were not spared. Sarah, only 10, was expected to cook and clean with her mother, learning the skills of domestic life under Samuel's strict eye. James, a boy of 7, was put to work in the fields, scaring crows from the crops and carrying feed to the pigs. Childhood in the Harker home was not a period of play or growth, but a season of toil, stripped of laughter and softened edges. The neighbors, who lived far enough away that only scraps of rumor reached their ears, occasionally noted the absence of the children in the local schoolhouse. Education was a privilege in rural communities, but most families made the effort to provide at least a few months of schooling each year. The Harker children, however, rarely appeared. When questioned, Samuel's answer was curt. Work teaches more than books. That statement became both an explanation and a barrier, shutting down any further conversation. No one pressed the matter. Within the house itself, tension simmered at every moment. Samuel's voice, low and commanding, dictated the rhythm of daily life. When he spoke, his word was law, and dissent was unthinkable. Ruth's attempts to shield the children were subtle, small gestures that Samuel rarely noticed or chose to ignore. She would sneak them extra scraps of food when his back was turned, or let them rest for a few minutes longer before the day's labor began. But such moments of mercy were fleeting. More often than not, her efforts were caught and punished, not just by words, but by the cold, unyielding violence that Samuel was known to wield in the privacy of his home. It was the violence, more than the isolation, that neighbors began to suspect. Though they could not see inside the farmhouse, they could hear. The Harker land stretched wide, but on still nights, the cries carried across the fields. Shouts, screams, and the heavy thud of something striking against wood or flesh drifted into the ears of those who lived closest. At first, people dismissed it as the ordinary sounds of a strict father disciplining his children. Harshness was not uncommon in that era, and the line between discipline and abuse was often blurred. But over time, the cries grew too frequent, too prolonged, to be explained away. Visitors to the farm, few though they were, reported an atmosphere so thick with tension that even silence seemed heavy. One man, a traveling peddler, recalled being invited inside for water on a sweltering day. He described the interior as dark despite the sun outside, the curtains drawn, the air stifling. Ruth moved quickly, nervously, setting the jug before him with hands that trembled. Samuel stood nearby, watching, his expression flat but his presence oppressive. The children sat in the corner, their eyes fixed on the floorboards, as though afraid to even glance at the visitor. The peddler left quickly, unsettled by what he felt but could not name. Only later, after the horrors of the Harker farm came to light, did he understand the weight of what he had seen. There was also the matter of food. While Samuel's pigs thrived, growing sleek and fat on their diet, the family themselves appeared gaunt. Ruth and the children looked thinner with each passing season, their cheeks hollow, their clothes hanging loose. In contrast, Samuel himself remained strong, his frame still commanding. Some suggested he hoarded the best of the food for himself, giving the scraps to his family, and the excess to his pigs. Others whispered something darker, that the pigs were fed better than his own blood, that he valued their health above that of his wife and children. Such talk was half rumor, half instinct, born from the unease Samuel inspired. The growing tension within the household began to manifest outwardly. Ruth's appearances in town dwindled to none. The children disappeared entirely from public life. Questions were asked quietly in the corners of the market, over fence posts between neighbors. Why did no one see them anymore? Why were the Harkers never invited to church gatherings, never present at celebrations or community events? Samuel's excuse was always the same. The farm needed tending. The family was busy. Work came first. But the explanation wore thin as time passed and the absences stretched longer. For those who lived closest, the change in the farm itself became noticeable. The farmhouse windows, once opened in the spring for fresh air, now remained shut. The fields, usually buzzing with the activity of children's laughter mixed with labor, grew silent. Only the pigs made noise constant, restless, their squeals carrying across the land. At night, the lanterns still burned inside the farmhouse long after other homes had gone dark. Shadows moved across the curtains, sharp and sudden, like gestures made in anger. Some tried to intervene in small ways. A neighbor woman once brought over bread under the pretense of kindness. Ruth opened the door only a crack, her face pale, her voice low as she thanked the woman and hurriedly took the gift. Behind her, Samuel's shadow loomed, and the door closed with a force that made the visitor flinch. She did not try again. Another man offered to let Thomas help with his own farm for a day, thinking it might give the boy a chance to escape his father's control, even briefly. Samuel refused flatly, his tone brooking no argument. "My boy's work is here," he said, and that was the end of it. By the early months of 1857, the tension had become unbearable to those watching from the outside. Something was happening within the walls of the Harker home, something hidden but poisonous, eating away at the family. And yet no one knew just how far it had gone. The neighbors could only guess, only whisper, only wonder at the strange silence that hung over the farm like a fog. What they did not know was that the violence they suspected had already begun to claim its victims, and that the pigs Samuel cared for so diligently were being prepared for a role no one in the community could have imagined. It was the calm before the storm, the final days of uneasy quiet, before the truth of the Harker household burst into the open, a truth so grotesque it would etch itself into memory for generations. The disappearances began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though they were nothing more than the ordinary comings and goings of a farm family. Life in rural Pennsylvania was not one of constant visibility. People often stayed close to their land for long stretches of time, and neighbors sometimes went weeks without seeing one another. It was this rhythm of rural isolation that allowed Samuel Harker's sinister work to pass unnoticed at first. The signs were subtle, but for those who paid attention, the pattern became too disturbing to ignore. It was Ruth who vanished first from the public eye. In previous years, though her appearances in town were rare and muted, she could still be counted on to accompany Samuel at least once or twice each season. She would stand a pace behind him, quiet, eyes cast down as he conducted his business. Then, in the late summer of 1857, she stopped appearing altogether. Samuel came alone to the market, his cart loaded with sacks of grain and salted pork, his expression as unreadable as ever. When questioned about her absence, he explained that illness had struck her. "The heat has weakened her," he muttered to one vendor. To another, he said she had taken to her bed and could not be roused to travel. The explanation varied slightly depending on whom he spoke to, but no one pressed the matter too far. Illness was common, after all. People fell sick, and sometimes they died quickly, without much warning. But if Ruth was truly sick, it struck some as odd that there was no talk of a doctor being summoned. In those days, physicians were scarce in rural areas, but most families made some effort to seek help if a wife or a mother was bedridden. When neighbors hinted at this, Samuel's response was curt. Ruth was resting, and there was nothing more to be said. His voice carried a finality that discouraged further questions. And so Ruth's absence was explained away as best it could be, though it left a sour taste in the mouths of those who remembered her pale, drawn face and trembling hands. The children's disappearances followed not long after. Thomas, the eldest, had been the most visible of the three, occasionally spotted at the edges of the property, or following Samuel into town with heavy loads of firewood or livestock feed. One day he was simply gone. When asked, Samuel said the boy was unwell, struck with the same mysterious malady that had confined his mother. At other times, he suggested Thomas was simply too busy with farm work to be seen. The excuses were thin, but Samuel's reputation for hostility was enough to silence most questions. People accepted his words reluctantly because to push further was to invite trouble. Sarah and James, the younger children, disappeared more quietly still. Few had seen them in town for months, and their absence raised less alarm at first. Yet when a schoolteacher noted that neither had attended a single day of lessons that year, she mentioned it in passing to another parent, who in turn whispered it to a neighbor. Soon the whispers began to form a pattern. A mother bedridden with illness, a son too sick to appear, 2 younger children kept away from school, all in the span of a single season. The story did not quite fit together, but the pieces were troubling enough to stir unease. The unease deepened when people began to notice the lack of funerals. Death, when it came to rural communities, was an event that involved everyone. Families built coffins by hand, neighbors dug graves, Ministers led services in small chapels or beneath open skies. Yet despite Ruth's supposed illness, despite Samuel's hints that his children too were unwell, no announcement of death was ever made. No procession seen, no grave dug. Instead, the Harker farm remained silent, its windows shuttered, its yard empty except for the restless movement of pigs in their pens. The absence of ritual, of mourning, was as loud as any scream. Those who dared to pass by the farm began to remark on the animals. The pigs, they said, were thriving as never before. Their bellies swelled with abundance. Their bodies grew fat and sleek, and their appetites seemed insatiable. Visitors to Samuel's farm, few though they were, noted how he seemed to feed them constantly, carrying buckets heavy with slop, dumping them into the pens with a kind of grim dedication. Yet the pigs' food did not resemble the ordinary scraps and grain most farmers used. Some swore they saw bones among the refuse, strange cuts of meat that looked too large, too human, to be the cast-offs of livestock alone. The rumors, whispered at first with nervous laughter, soon took on a darker tone. Meanwhile, Samuel's story shifted to accommodate the questions he could not ignore. To some, he said his wife had passed quietly in her sleep, but he preferred to keep the matter private. To others, he suggested that Thomas had been sent away to work on a distant relative's farm, though no one could confirm which relative or where the farm was located. About Sarah and James, he said almost nothing at all, brushing aside inquiries with a dismissive wave of his hand. The inconsistencies only fed the growing suspicion, though few dared to confront him directly. What unsettled people most was his demeanor. Grief has a way of showing itself even in those who try to hide it. A man who loses his wife or children might grow hollow, distant, his sorrow bleeding through in gestures he cannot contain. But Samuel displayed none of this. He remained as cold and impassive as ever, his face giving away nothing. He continued to bring pork to market, his goods always plentiful, always of high quality. He spoke as little as before, neither volunteering information nor inviting sympathy. If anything, he seemed strengthened by his solitude, as though the absence of his family had lightened his burdens rather than broken his heart. It was in the autumn that the townspeople began to speak openly of their suspicions. The stories were told in hushed voices at church gatherings, in the corners of the tavern, in the aisles of the general store. "Have you seen Ruth?" one would ask. "No," another would reply. "Not since the spring." Then came the next question, whispered more cautiously. "And the children?" Silence usually followed, broken only by the uneasy shifting of feet. By then, too many people had noticed the same thing. Too many had heard the cries that carried across the fields, the sudden silence that followed, the restless squeals of pigs in the night. Still, suspicion is not proof. In that time, without the resources of modern investigation, without photographs or records to confirm the truth, the community relied on what they could see with their own eyes. And Samuel allowed them to see nothing. His farmhouse remained closed, his answers evasive. Without bodies, without graves, there was nothing tangible to confront him with. Only whispers, only rumors, only the uneasy sense that something terrible had happened behind those shuttered windows. Yet the truth, though hidden, left its traces. A scrap of fabric caught in the mud near the pig pens, recognized by one neighbor as the hem of a dress Ruth had once worn. A child's shoe half buried in the dirt, too small to belong to any but Sarah or James. These fragments were quickly dismissed by Samuel when questioned. "Old things," he said, cast aside. But for those who saw them, they became quiet evidence of what their hearts already feared. By the end of that year, the disappearances could no longer be explained away as illness or absence. The Harker family, once 5, now seemed to consist of only one. Samuel stood alone at the market, alone in his fields, alone with his pigs. His wife and children had vanished into silence, leaving behind no graves, no memorials, no farewells. And though the town did not yet have the courage to speak the word aloud, a terrible thought began to root itself in their minds that Samuel Harker had not lost his family to sickness or accident, but had made them vanish by his own hand. It was the thought that would soon drive the townsfolk to act, and when they did, what they uncovered would prove far worse than any rumor they had dared to whisper. The autumn winds brought with them a chill that seemed to deepen the unease surrounding the Harker farm. The harvest season, usually a time of shared labor and celebration among rural families, passed without any sign of Ruth or the children. Samuel worked the fields alone, his movements tireless, his figure silhouetted against the fading sun as though he were the only living soul on that patch of land. The farm, once filled with the noise of children's voices and the quiet bustle of family life, had grown unnaturally still, yet one sound remained constant: the pigs. Their squeals and grunts rose from the pens at all hours, insistent and hungry, a chorus that carried far across the countryside. It was this sound, and the sight of the animals growing fatter and stronger even as the family disappeared, that began to gnaw at the minds of the townsfolk. Whispers turned into suspicions, and suspicions into determination. By November of 1857, a small group of neighbors gathered at the edge of the dirt road leading to Samuel's property. They spoke in low voices, weighing their duty against their fear. It was no easy thing to interfere in another man's household in those days. Privacy was guarded fiercely, and to accuse a man of wrongdoing without proof was to risk ruinous consequences. Yet the unease had reached a point where silence felt like complicity. Too many people had heard the cries that cut across the fields at night. Too many had noticed the strange scraps of fabric and small belongings near the pig pens. Too many had watched as Samuel appeared at market, week after week, with more meat than a single farm of his size should rightly produce. It was agreed that a visit would be made, not under the guise of accusation, but of concern. A group of men, including the local minister and 2 farmers who lived closest to the Harker land, approached the farmhouse one cold morning. They knocked on the door, calling Samuel's name. After a long pause, he appeared, his face as impassive as ever, his expression betraying neither surprise nor welcome. He listened to their questions without emotion. How was Ruth? How were the children? Why had no one seen them in so long? Samuel's answers were as curt as they had always been. Ruth had died, he said simply, buried on the property in a private service. The children were sent away to relatives helping with the farm work elsewhere. His voice was flat, unyielding, as though daring anyone to press further. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They asked if they might see the graves, pay their respects. Samuel's eyes hardened. "That's family business," he said, his tone closing the conversation like a slammed door. The men left reluctantly, and their suspicions heavier than before. Though they had no proof, what they carried back with them was enough to stir the rest of the town. It was not until several weeks later that the first concrete evidence appeared. A boy from a neighboring farm, chasing after a stray dog, wandered close to the Harker pig pens. What he saw there sent him running home in terror. In the mud of the pen lay bones, not the smooth, clean bones of butchered livestock, but smaller, more delicate. Intermixed with them was fabric, torn and filthy, but recognizable as belonging to a dress. The boy's father, upon hearing the story, dismissed it at first as childish fancy. Yet when he went to the farm the next day, under the pretense of trading, he saw for himself what lay scattered in the dirt: fragments of bone, gnawed and broken, and what looked like a small shoe buried in the muck. He left without a word, his stomach twisting with dread. The news spread quickly. Within days, half the town had heard the story, and fear took root in their hearts. For weeks they had whispered of Samuel's odd behavior, his evasive answers, his pigs that seemed unnaturally well fed. Now those whispers were confirmed by the evidence of bones in the pens. Yet still, fear of Samuel's wrath kept most from taking direct action. He was a man known for his temper, and though he had no friends, he inspired a kind of wary respect born of intimidation. To accuse him outright, without the authority of the law, was to risk violence. It was the minister who finally decided the matter could not be ignored. With winter closing in, he called upon the county sheriff, urging him to investigate. At first the sheriff was reluctant. Such accusations were grave, and he required proof before he could act. But the stories had become too numerous, the fear too widespread. He gathered a small group of men and rode out to the Harker farm one gray morning, determined to see the truth for himself. When they arrived, Samuel was already at work carrying buckets to the pig pens. He set them down and turned to face the visitors, his eyes cold and unreadable. The sheriff stated his purpose plainly. He had come to inspect the farm, to put to rest the rumors that had spread throughout the county. Samuel said nothing at first, his jaw tightening as he listened. Finally, he stepped aside and gestured with one hand. "Look where you will," he muttered. The men fanned out, some entering the farmhouse, while others approached the pig pens. The house was sparse, its rooms stripped of warmth, the hearth cold, the furniture worn and empty. There were no signs of Ruth or the children, no clothing, no personal belongings, no traces of their lives at all. It was as though they had been erased, their presence scrubbed from the home. In the pens, however, the evidence was unmistakable. Among the mud and straw, the sheriff's men uncovered bones, small, fragile, bearing the marks of teeth. Some still carried fragments of flesh. Torn fabric lay nearby, stained and rotting. The pigs, enormous and restless, crowded around, grunting and squealing as though eager for the next feeding. The sheriff himself knelt in the muck, lifting a bone that had been half buried in the dirt. It was a child's femur, unmistakable in its size and shape. He held it up for the others to see, and a heavy silence fell over the group. There was no more doubt. The rumors were true. Samuel Harker had not lost his family to illness or sent them away to relatives. He had murdered them, one by one, and fed their bodies to the very animals he seemed to love more than his own blood. When confronted, Samuel did not flinch. He did not deny it. Instead, he stared at the sheriff with the same cold expression he had always worn. "Waste not," he said simply, his voice calm, almost indifferent. The words chilled the men to their core, for they carried no hint of remorse, no flicker of guilt. To Samuel it seemed what he had done was not a crime, but a practicality, an extension of the same brutal logic with which he had run his farm and his household. The sheriff ordered him taken into custody at once. As the men bound his hands and led him away, the pigs squealed behind them, their fat bodies pressing against the wooden slats of the pen. The sound was grotesque, as though the animals themselves were protesting the loss of their provider. The men tried not to look back, but the image of the bones, the scraps of clothing, and the restless animals burned into their minds, never to be forgotten. When the news reached the town, horror spread like wildfire. People who had once whispered their suspicions now spoke openly of the evil that had lurked so close to their homes. Mothers clutched their children tighter, fathers cursed themselves for not acting sooner, and the market stalls buzzed with stories of what the sheriff's men had seen. The Harker farm became a place of dread, its soil stained with the memory of unspeakable acts. And though Samuel was taken away to face trial, the image of his pigs fattened on human flesh, squealing in their pens, lingered in the minds of all who had lived through that dark season. The grim discovery was only the beginning of the nightmare that would unfold, for the trial that followed would reveal details more grotesque than anyone could have imagined. The trial of Samuel Harker began in the early spring of 1858, a season when most people were eager to leave behind the harshness of winter and turn toward renewal. Yet in the county courthouse, the atmosphere was anything but hopeful. The small stone building overflowed with people from every corner of the region, drawn by equal parts fear, curiosity, and a morbid hunger to see justice done. News of the horrors uncovered at the Harker farm had traveled far beyond the county lines. Newspapers from Philadelphia and even New York had picked up the story, branding Samuel with names that stuck like tar: the cannibal farmer, the hog butcher of Pennsylvania, the man who fed his blood to beasts. What had once been whispered rumors on dusty rural roads had now become front-page headlines, and the trial promised to give voice to all the unspeakable details that had so far been hidden behind closed doors. From the moment Samuel was led into the courtroom, bound and watched closely by armed deputies, it was clear this would not be an ordinary case. He stood tall, gaunt, but strong, his face impassive as always, his eyes betraying nothing. The townsfolk who had once feared him from a distance now found themselves studying him openly, trying to glimpse some hint of the monster they believed him to be. Yet what unsettled them most was not a display of rage or madness, but his calm. He looked upon the crowd as though they were beneath his notice, as though their horror and judgment were of no consequence to him at all. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the grim evidence. Witness after witness was called to describe what they had seen on the Harker farm. The sheriff testified first, holding up the child's bone he had pulled from the muck of the pig pen. His words were stark, and as he recounted the discovery of gnawed bones and torn clothing, the crowd shuddered audibly. Several women left the room in tears, unable to bear the imagery. Then came the farmer who had spotted fabric scraps near the pens, the boy who had stumbled upon bones while chasing his dog, and the neighbor woman who recalled the pale, trembling Ruth opening her door for bread only months before she vanished. Their accounts formed a chilling mosaic, each piece fitting to the larger, horrific picture. Most damning of all, however, were the remains themselves. The prosecution had gathered what little could be recovered from the pens and the ground around them: fragments of bone, pieces of fabric, a child's shoe, a hair ribbon caked in mud. These items were displayed on a table before the jury, mute testimony to the lives that had been consumed. The pigs had destroyed much of the evidence, their powerful jaws and relentless appetites leaving little behind, but what remained was enough. A physician from Philadelphia was brought in to confirm that the bones belonged to a woman and 2 children. He spoke with a clinical detachment, yet even his measured words carried a weight that pressed upon the room like a shroud. The defense had little with which to work. Samuel's appointed lawyer, a weary man in his 50s, attempted to suggest that the evidence was circumstantial, that the bones could have been animal remains mistaken for human, that the neighbors' accounts were colored by gossip and fear. But the arguments rang hollow in the face of what had been found. When Samuel himself was asked if he wished to speak in his defense, he rose, his hands resting on the rail before him, and uttered words that froze the courtroom into silence. "They were mine," he said simply. "What I did with them was my choice. Waste not." The room erupted in gasps and cries. Mothers clutched their children. Men shouted in outrage. The judge pounded his gavel for order. Samuel stood unmoving, his expression calm, his voice without emotion. It was not a confession born of guilt, nor one of defiance, but something worse, a statement of cold, practical belief. To him, there was no crime in what he had done, only a grim efficiency. His words became the most quoted line in the case, repeated in every newspaper, whispered in every tavern and parlor, until they became synonymous with his name. The trial stretched on for weeks, though its outcome was never in doubt. Each day brought new testimony, more gruesome details, more horror for the gathered crowds. A blacksmith testified that Samuel had once purchased a cleaver larger than most used in butchering livestock, though he never saw him use it on animals. A peddler described the eerie silence of the farmhouse, the way Ruth and the children sat motionless under Samuel's gaze. A neighbor swore that on a still night he had heard the unmistakable sound of screaming carried across the fields, followed by the squeals of pigs. Each story reinforced the same image, a household ruled by cruelty, consumed by fear, and finally destroyed by the hand of the man who should have protected it. The newspapers spared no detail in their coverage. Some embellished the story, claiming that Samuel had practiced cannibalism himself, though no evidence supported the claim. Others painted him as a kind of demon, a figure of pure evil, who had descended upon an innocent family. Woodcut illustrations depicted him with wild eyes and bloodied hands, standing before ravenous pigs. The public devoured these accounts with a mixture of revulsion and fascination. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse each day, straining for a glimpse of the man whose deeds had shocked the nation. The defense made one final attempt to sway the jury by pleading insanity, suggesting that no sane man could commit such acts. But even this rang false. Samuel's calm, measured demeanor, his clear recollections, his cold logic, all pointed not to madness, but to a deliberate, calculated choice. He was not raving, not lost in delusion. He was simply unrepentant, and that, to many, was worse than madness. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty on all counts. The words echoed through the chamber, and a murmur of relief swept the crowd. Some wept, others prayed, a few even cheered, though the judge quickly silenced them. Samuel himself showed no reaction. He stood as he always had, his face carved in stone, as though the outcome were meaningless to him. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he paused for a long moment, then spoke only this: "They are gone, and I remain. That is enough." The judge, his voice shaking with anger, pronounced the sentence of death. Samuel would hang by the neck until dead. The execution was scheduled for the following month, to allow time for appeals that no one expected would succeed. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted once more, not with relief this time, but with a hunger for vengeance. Men shouted that the hanging should be public, that the whole county should witness his end. Women called him a devil, a beast in human form. The sheriff had to push through the mob to deliver Samuel safely back to his cell, for there were those who would have gladly seen him torn apart on the spot. The weeks that followed were filled with anticipation. Newspapers printed daily updates, speculating on whether Samuel would repent, whether he would finally show remorse. Ministers visited his cell, urging him to confess his sins, to seek forgiveness before it was too late. But Samuel remained silent. He ate when food was given to him, slept when he was tired, and stared at the stone walls as though he were already carved into them. He neither admitted guilt nor denied it. He simply existed, waiting. On the morning of his execution, the gallows were surrounded by hundreds who had traveled miles to see the end of the man who had haunted their imaginations. Samuel walked calmly to the platform, his step steady, his face unreadable. When asked if he had any final words, he looked out at the crowd, his eyes sweeping over their faces, and said only, "The pigs are still hungry." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by shouts of outrage. The executioner pulled the hood over his head, the rope tightened, and the trapdoor fell. The crowd erupted as his body dropped, some cheering, others crossing themselves, many turning away in horror. The farmer who had once lived in silence and cruelty was gone, but the echo of his words remained. The trial of Samuel Harker became one of the most notorious cases of its century, not just for the crimes themselves, but for the coldness with which they were committed and confessed. His story lived on in newspapers, in whispered tales by firelight, in the fearful glances cast at lonely farms and restless pig pens. And though justice had been done in the eyes of the law, the horror of what he had done left a scar that no sentence could erase. The name Samuel Harker was spoken for years afterward, a reminder of how darkness can fester in silence, and how even the most ordinary farm can hide unimaginable evil. If stories like this leave you uneasy, if you find yourself drawn to the darker corners of history, where fact and folklore twist together, then you'll want to stay close. Subscribe, and you'll never miss another tale that should have been left forgotten.